Alright, so we are now going to be going through our first reading in Mr.G Reads. As I said in the explanation video, we're going to be covering the Fibonacci Murders by Dale E. Lehman. Again, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. So a little bit about the book. At the start of each chapter, there's a brief interlude where someone's discussing certain things. So I'll be reading that, followed by the chapter. For this book, I'm only going to read the first 3 chapters on this channel. Okay? So without further ado, here we go. Chapter 1. First, I must state 2 things. I'm a mathematician, and I'm not crazy. I mention the first because it alone explains my involvement in the events that recently took place in Howard County, Maryland. Otherwise, I would have had no connection to them whatsoever and would have been spared injury. I mention the second for 2 reasons. First, strangeness is associated in the public mind with my profession, notwithstanding that relatively few mathematicians are odder than the average person. Second, it seems to me that the tale I'm about to tell could only have been imagined by a lunatic. Indeed, there was a lunatic, but he was not I. With those points in mind, let us proceed. Mathematical studies typically begin with a question or curious observation. In this case, it begins with both. The envelope had landed on top of a pile of paperwork. To the casual glance, one snowflake in a storm. Snowflakes are supposed to be unique, Detective Lieutenant Rick Peller thought as he eyed it. But if you don't look closely, you don't notice the differences, and who looks closely in a blizzard? Snow was on Peller's mind just then. It lay 16 inches deep and counting on the ground outside Northern District headquarters, and, more to the point, on streets rendered impassable by the stuff. The whole of Maryland east of the mountains had flown into a panic as the late February storm trundled up from the south. Residents stripped grocery shelves of milk, bread, and toilet paper. Now few were out and about, aside from TV reporters bundled up alongside impassable roads, informing viewers how treacherous and, well, impassable those roads were. "Stay home," they told the camera. "Just stay home." The Mugger Criminal Investigations Division detectives had privately dubbed the Mad Golfer, had apparently been following that advice. Not that he'd find any victims if he did try to play in the snow. A good thing, certainly, but with a downside. Peller wouldn't make any progress on the case today. They had little to go on, aside from the location. All 4 attacks had occurred in or around Centennial Park, and the medical reports describing nearly identical wounds on the backs of the heads of the victims who had been relieved of their money and jewelry. Only one victim remembered much of anything. The bloodied head of a Wilson 9-iron resting on the ground in front of his face while someone, squatting beside him like a pro lining up a putt, yanked his Omega watch from his wrist. Well, there was no good way to get beat up, but at least nobody had died. And just maybe the victims would have a weird story to tell their grandkids someday. Peller eyed the newly arrived envelope without much interest. It couldn't possibly have a blood-stained golf club inside, at any rate. Neatly hand-lettered in a tight script addressed to him personally, postmarked 3 days ago on Friday, February 25th, in Cambridge, on the Eastern Shore, it bore a return address he didn't recognize. Some place called Leonardo's of Pisa. An Italian restaurant? Peller didn't care much for pasta. Having grown up in Lockport, New York, 30 miles northeast of Buffalo, he was principally a meat and potatoes man, although he had taken a liking to the Chesapeake's region's specialty, the blue crab. He took up the envelope and weighed it by feel. It was light, as though it only contained a single sheet of paper, and upon opening it, he discovered he was right. The paper was folded into precise thirds, and in the same neat script as on the envelope, it bore an odd message. Peller read it twice, feeling his mouth twist itself into a frown. I start with 0. Nobody dies today. "Hey, Karina," he called over his shoulder. "Come have a look at this." The slight, dark-haired woman gazing through the window at the falling snow pivoted her head. Thanks to the storm, she was one of only 4 detectives currently in the office. Peller smiled inwardly as she rushed to his side, swerving around unoccupied chairs and battered desks. The woman never did anything at a leisurely pace. The scowl with which she had regarded the outside world remained fixed to her face as she approached, but Peller knew it wasn't for him. When she was 14, Karina Montefar had come with her family to the U.S. from Guatemala. Winter hadn't been part of her lexicon then, and even 21 years later, now a detective sergeant, she looked upon it as an unpleasant aberration. "You found a golf club in the slush?" she asked, deadpan. Her accent was lighter, Peller thought, than it had been several years ago, as though she'd been consciously ridding herself of it. "I wish," he nodded at the note now lying on his desk. "This came in the mail. Better not touch it without gloves." She bent over the note for a minute. Finally, she shook her head. "I don't get it. Who tells the cops they aren't going to whack somebody?" Peller pointed to the envelope. It came in that. "Leonardo's of Pisa. Sounds like an Italian restaurant. There's no such place, of course." "Oh?" She quick-stepped to her desk, set her fingers to the keyboard, and in a moment was scanning a list of restaurants in Cambridge. "Well, there wouldn't be, would there? It's some kind of stupid joke. Nope, nothing remotely like that name. The address doesn't map either." So why do I feel like I should take it seriously? I better bag this just in case. While Peller slipped envelope and note into an evidence bag, Montefar returned to his side and gazed at him without expression. "Because you need a vacation. Take some time off. Visit your son and his family." He read the note again through the gloss of the plastic bag. "I don't think so." "Rick!" He shot her a surprised look, then laughed. "I didn't mean that. I mean, that's not why I'm uneasy. This message, it's a promise." "That nobody dies?" "Just the opposite." Montefar regarded the note again. "I start with 0. But after 0 comes 1, Peller said. "Nobody dies today, but somebody does die tomorrow, or the day after, or the day after that." Montefar frowned as she considered the possibility. Maybe. But it still sounds like a joke to me. Who writes this kind of note? Before long, somebody did die. That night, the snow stopped. The clouds gave way to a clear sky dotted with glittering stars, or at least those bright enough to cut through the light pollution. And on Tuesday morning, Marylanders began the slow process of digging out. Peller wasn't sure if this was a case of March coming in like a lion, or of February going out like hyena, laughing at them as it bounded into the distance. Either way, he'd made it home in the previous evening, courtesy of his F-150 4x4 and experience negotiating the winters of northwest New York. The drive reminded him of a storm from his youth, a snowfall of over 1.5 feet followed by 2 days of sub-zero cold. A freshman in high school, he'd taken on a paper route that year. His father drove him through the pre-dawn chill both days so his customers could get what they'd paid for. Dad had managed a clothing store in town, but he'd grown up on a farm and didn't believe in letting a little thing like a spell of bad weather get in the way of work. Peller began shoveling out in the dim pre-dawn, layered up to keep the cold off until the heat of exertion kicked in. He didn't go in for snowblowers. He disliked the noise and figured the exercise was good for him. Besides, shoveling gave him time to think. Today he thought about what Montefiore had said. His wife Sandra had died 4 years back in an automobile accident. Her funeral was the last time he had seen Jason, Belinda, and the grandkids. Denver was a long way off. None of them had found the time or money to bridge the space. Or was that just an excuse? Maybe they were all afraid that seeing each other would bring back the pain of their shared loss. If so, it was a poor excuse. After 2 hours of carefully paced work, he was shoveled out. He rested with a cup of coffee and a cinnamon roll, then ventured back into the cold to start on his neighbor Jerry Suter's walk. Jerry was 93 and not quite as handy with a shovel as he used to be. Or at least that's what he said his doctor said, although Jerry himself only took it easy under protest. He had once shown Peller a photograph of himself in a World War II Army uniform. The photographer had captured the defiance in the eyes of the ebony-skinned man, and Peller had thought at the time that if the Allies had had a dozen more like Jerry, Hitler would still be running. Despite his advanced age, Jerry still stood ramrod straight, a seasoned veteran whose eyes had seen in a few short years a lifetime of woe. He had insisted, from the beginning of their acquaintance, that Peller call him Jerry, saying, "Jeremiah makes me sound like a 200-year-old white guy with a beard down to my kneecaps." Eventually, Peller became used to the name, but for a long time he had felt as though he were calling one of the three kings Balti. Peller had just about finished the job when his cell phone went off. A call from dispatch. "Don't tell me," he said. "Another golf clubbing?" "Even better," the dispatcher replied. "A patrolman found a snowplow driver shot in the head on Little Patuxent between the mall and Symphony Woods. We have officers and an ambulance on the scene. The victim's dead." "Well, damn. His plowing wasn't that bad, was it?" "Sorry. Shameless joke. As a Marylander, you probably wouldn't get it." "Want to bet?" "I'll be there in about 15-20 minutes, Peller said. As he hurried to his truck, he saw Souter looking out the window. Peller waved, and the old fellow saluted with his coffee cup. Normally Souter would have invited Peller in, but perhaps he could tell from the look on the detective's face that a visit would have to wait.